Hi, welcome to Apple This Week with me, Alex Webb, and Mark Gurman. We're both reporters on Bloomberg's tech team here in San Francisco. We're going to be talking through a few of the issues that have been arisen at Apple this week or affecting Apple. We're going to touch on a few things. Google, of course, has a phone that's come to market. There's been some news about a new Apple HQ in London. We've had some scoops out of Asia as well on OLED, and there's been some speculation about the new MacBook. But let's kick off with the Google phone. You were at their event this week. What does it mean for Apple, basically, this competing product?
Well, Apple and Google have gone head-to-head for years in the software game. Apple came out with iOS with the first iPhone in 2007. Android followed up with Android about a year later. There was a whole clash between Steve Jobs and other Apple executives versus Google CEO at the time, Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt ended up resigning from the Apple board. It was a complete war between the two companies, but it was all software related. And Apple's bread and butter, as we know, is margins, making money on their products, profits. Google is now entering that same game with the Pixel phones, the Pixel and the Pixel XL. And funny enough, they cost the same as the iPhone. So now Apple has an actual challenger from their biggest competitor out of Google, the Pixel phone. And this comes at a time where Apple's historical biggest challenger in the hardware market, Samsung, is really fighting bad PR around their phones exploding. And even today, there's reports out of the web on Twitter that a Samsung replacement phone with the supposed new battery exploded on a Southwest flight this morning. Thankfully, nobody was hurt and nothing went wrong on to any people there, but it's still really a black eye for Samsung. So this is a big deal for Apple.
I should interject very quickly. If you do have any questions for us, please put them on Facebook. We're streaming on Facebook Live on Bloomberg.com and I think also on YouTube. So please send any questions our way. We should do our best to answer them. One of the things that jumped out at me as well from the Google event is there was a huge emphasis on the Google Assistant, on their smart assistant, which is embedded in their phone. Now, of course, on the iPhone, if I say, I won't say it because maybe everybody's phone will jump out, but if you were to say, hey Siri, then everybody's phone starts beeping at you. The crucial difference is that, of course, you can't just say to your phone, OK Google, without going into the Google app.
Now you just lit up everyone's Android phones.
Right, there we go. So let's try and do the triumvirate and look out for Alexa. But I think I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on how great a motivation that is for Google to ensure that they are owning that interaction with the customer.
Right, so Apple has really used its software to sell its hardware, and they really go together. The hardware is the conduit to getting to Apple's software. But Google's positioning its new Assistant feature, which is sort of like a mix of Google Now and Siri, a bunch of other machine learning AI stuff, as a way to get to its hardware. So if you want a Pixel phone, you're really wanting it for the Assistant because of everything that it could do. The coolest thing that I saw from the Assistant at the event yesterday was that you don't have to pre-install any applications to tap into different networks. For example, right out of the box, you can call an Uber with Google Assistant, whereas on the iPhone with Siri, you would have to download the Uber app, install the plugin, and set up the plugin to work between Siri and the Uber application. This knows it's much smarter than Siri from that perspective. I guess the good part for Apple is that all of this stuff where Google Assistant really shines is very surface level. It's not deep in the voice technology, but it's just around the edges. So that's something that would likely be more easy for Apple to add over time versus catching up in that regard being a long-term initiative.
So Apple has the huge network of developers which they can tap into, I guess, a lot more readily than Google can. But then, there have been criticisms about Siri's ability to understand intent, and that's perhaps where they've got to catch up with Google.
Exactly, and Google has a plethora of different partners and developers that it's working with, already talking to for this Google Assistant feature, for that app functionality we just discussed. Apple, however, they introduced their Siri API to allow developers like Uber and Yelp and OpenTable to get into it just a few months ago. But the issue is that it's very limited. There's only 5 or 6 different categories of applications that are compatible with Apple's voice assistant. There's sending money, there's mapping, to-do list type of things, but it really is limited by the developer types being capped right from the beginning.
And I suppose the flip side of it, of course, that might be somewhere where Google has the edge. And you and Mark Bergen, our colleague, had a good story on this morning. Apple, of course, has the edge in its vast network of retail outlets.
That's right. In terms of selling this phone, it's very limited. They're going to be selling out of Best Buy. They're going to be selling out of Verizon wireless stores. and they're going to be selling from their Google website as well as other major carrier partners in other parts of the world. However, Apple has this vast network of over 400 retail stores around the globe where anyone can walk in and buy an iPhone, of course, when they have the supply ready. But right now, Google's only in-house retail initiative besides its online store through Google Play is a single store opening up in New York City from October 20th, the release date, the street date of the phone, through the holiday season. Google's considered other retail initiatives like formal Apple-like stores in the past, but who knows what they're going to do now.
And I mean, it's taken Apple, over a decade to build out these 400 stores, so it's a big ask for Google to do that immediately.
Right. I mean, to be fair, Google could have started doing it for their Nexus products in years prior. They have some pop-up stores in airports. But to also be fair, this is their first complete in-house supply chain initiative where they're putting a lot of the legwork in, whereas Apple first came out with the iPhone in 2007, and all these tricks and such that all came after learning from different generations. So we'll see where Google's at in 5 years from now, and then we can get a true comparison about who did the first 5 years of their smartphone better, Apple or Google?
Well, perhaps the second 5 years, because Google's already had one of sorts, but
right,
it's a slightly different price point, clearly.
I can't wait to see your story about that in 5 years from now.
Well, let's see. We've got a question come in asking about the price compared to the iPhone of the Pixel and the size.
Right. Funny enough, the pricing of the Pixel is 100% identical to the pricing of the iPhone. The 32 gigabyte iPhone 7 is $649. Likewise is the 32 gigabyte Pixel. And just like the iPhone comes in a regular and a plus size, Pixel comes in a regular and an XL size. The difference is the smaller of the two phones on the iPhone is 4.7 inches, and the smaller of the two Pixel phones is 5 inches. So you have, a third of an inch difference between the smaller iPhone and the smaller Google Pixel. When I was testing out the new phones a few weeks ago, I had both in my hand, the new Pixels, and I said to the Google employees that I was with, these seem so similar. I think that the Google Pixel should have a bigger difference between the two. When you hold an iPhone and an iPhone Plus in each different hand, you can really tell the big difference. But looking at both of the Pixel phones, it just doesn't seem like there's enough of a distinction for them to charge a $100 difference between the two. So we'll see if in later models they change that, either making the smaller one smaller or the bigger one bigger, or just choosing one size in between.
Let's maybe dig into some of the other issues we've had this week. As a Brit, this is clearly of interest to me, but Apple is going to move into a new headquarters in London for its London employees in, I think, maybe 2021, about 1,400 employees. But interestingly, it's going to be in Battersea Power Plant. Now, I don't know if any of you are Pink Floyd fans, but that's the huge red brick building with the 4 towers, white towers, which you see in the famous album cover with the pig flying in front of it. So it's a very iconic building in London, being a big question mark over its future for a long time, and it seems sort of very Apple to be moving into that sort of iconic location.
Absolutely. They've done this many times in some of their major flagship stores. They're in Covent Garden as well as London. There's another London store. They have a store by the Louvre in France. They have the Fifth Avenue Cube store, which they're renovating, by the way, soon, in New York. So they've really hit some of the bigger landmark places around the world for their stores, so it does make sense. It's also interesting because we know that Apple has their new campus in Cupertino opening next year. So it seems that they're doing a wholesale revamp of their whole headquarter initiative.
And of course, increasingly, we were talking about AI, and Siri, of course, is Apple's product, Google Assistant, and there's a huge talent grab at the moment, fighting to try and get the best people. Having really iconic properties clearly helps in that. I think it's something that Bloomberg does as well. We've got really nice locations, and it is an extra selling point to try and get the best talent through the doors, ideally. Although I can't speak for the two of us.
It's definitely a perk. To have the offices, different startups and big corporate entities like Apple and Google, Facebook, they're all trying new things to get the best engineers on the block. And like you said, Alex, having a great campus with great resources is one of those elements.
We had a little story out of Asia. Our colleague Takashi Amano saying that Apple's been in talks with Sharp about supplying OLED screens. We don't know for certain they're the only people they've been speaking about supplying OLED screens to, but Sharp is now part of the Foxconn universe. It does add more weight to what I think is one of the worst kept secrets about the next generation of iPhone, the one which will arrive sometime next year, that it's likely to have an OLED display. I mean, the OLED display, what are your thoughts on how it can help?
An OLED display makes perfect sense for the iPhone, and we've reported already that the next phone is not going to have a physical home button. Instead, it's going to be embedded into the display itself, and that will work with the new OLED screen. It makes things more efficient, which can open up new battery life opportunities. The screen is a bit crisper, higher density. Overall, it'll be a big difference. I remember when the iPhone 4 came out in 2010, comparing that to the 3GS from the year prior, the difference was night and day, and I feel like this is going to be just like that again next year.
And of course, because you don't need a backlit display, then you can there's more space for hardware inside the phone.
Exactly.
Potentially then battery life is helped.
Exactly.
OLED is also less energy intensive,
Yep.
so one imagines the battery life will be the huge difference.
And it just looks better. And back to the Pixel that we were talking about earlier, that has an AMOLED display, which would be similar to Apple's.
So OLED, I should clarify, is organic light-emitting diodes. So at the moment, a lot of phones are based on different technology, light-emitting diodes. Of course, you know from your lighting, and most lighting is now LED, but organic, it just means that it's based on essentially sort of carbon-based organisms which help run this stuff.
It's interesting how long it's taken Apple to get into the OLED display space, because OLED has been a technology growing out of its infancy already for 3-4 years. So it's interesting that they're still on their current LED Retina technology. But of course, with Apple, we're not talking apples to apples with other manufacturers.
I see what you did there.
Because of their scale, they have to, their timeline for hitting a new component is different than many other companies.
Yeah, because they've got to roll out tens, if not hundreds of millions of phones when they go to market.
Exactly.
Another little tidbit, and Apple sort of quietly announced this week, is that their earnings will be at a different time. They had planned to announce on the 27th. It's now going to be on the 25th. That spurred a certain amount of speculation among some of the Apple writing ecosphere, the blogs and so on, that perhaps that was suggesting there was going to be the new MacBook launch around that time. To my mind, that seems highly unlikely. It'd be a hell of a foul up if they had conflicted within the same company, or scheduled within the same company, conflicting events. But nonetheless, we are expecting sometime this month, we think at least, new MacBooks.
So we reported a few months ago that Apple's working on a series of new Macs, a new version of the MacBook Air, a new iMac, a new display with collaborative elements with LG from South Korea. But the big star of this show, whether it's an event or a press release or some way of announcing it on their website or online, is going to be a new version of the Mac Pro. It's going to have speaking of OLED, an OLED function row to quickly tap into shortcuts, so they're accessible to all users, not only
sort of like the F1 to 12 type buttons are replaced,
virtual,
right?
Sort of like an iPhone, where you can change the icons depending on what you're doing. So that will be the star of the show. We know that Apple is planning to announce at least some of those Macs, at least that MacBook Pro, at some point during the month of October. So is it going to be on the date that the earnings call was originally scheduled for? Who knows? Would Apple really make an error like that? I don't know. That would be a pretty significant mistake, and something that would be, I certainly haven't heard of Apple doing that before. Maybe some other companies.
They changed the date of their earnings earlier this year because it was coinciding with the memorial service for a former executive. Now, clearly that's not something you can plan, and
exactly.
All kudos to them for changing it on that basis, but that would be quite a foul up. Do we think, is there anything, so we've got somebody asking, is the Pixel better than the iPhone? It's hard for us to make that kind of judgment, but there are pros and cons both ways.
Sure.
We've spoken a little bit about the OK Google element and versus Hey Siri, but then there are some things like the ability to store photos in the cloud.
Right.
Google's not charging for that.
Right. So Apple charges a few bucks a month to store all of your photos in the cloud. If you want to,
or more than 5 gigabytes worth.
More than 5 gigabytes worth. So, for instance, I think it's $3 a month to get 200 gigabytes. There's a 1 terabyte plan, a 200 gigabyte plan, a 2 terabyte plan now. And as these phones take higher resolution video, it'll be interesting. But with Google, if you have the Pixel phone, you don't have to pay extra to store it in the cloud. They do it for you. It has a smart storage feature. They tout it as a feature where you never run out of storage. But in reality, if you're running out of storage, they just make sure it's pushed to the cloud and move it from the phone, and you can just download it like that. The iPhone has that integrated where you can just store everything in the cloud, and they don't make a big fuss about it.
I think some of the proof is going to be in the pudding, clearly. Like, we know that I mean, none of us have really got to grips yet on an extended basis with the new Pixel phone, and so seeing quite how smoothly it operates and how well integrated it is, that's Apple's big USP, unique selling point.
Right.
They think that they wed hardware brilliantly with software, and so Google's ability to do that will be quite an interesting telltale.
Right, I took a few pictures a few weeks ago with the Pixel phones, took some videos. The image stabilization is excellent. It's on par with the iPhone. Some of the analytics scores on the Pixel camera touted is a bit better than the iPhone, but in reality, the pictures will probably look mostly the same if you're just using them in the real world, not scientifically. So I think you can't go wrong with either. If you're in Apple's ecosystem, get the iPhone. If you want the best way to access Google services like Calendar, Messaging, Google Assistant, GChat, Gmail, all of that, go for a Pixel phone. The real reason they're coming out with this phone is because they have all these services. This is their bread and butter. This is where the eyeballs go. This is where they make their money. And right now, anyone, Apple, Samsung, Huawei, they can take Google services, use the APIs, and present them any way they want. I know what it looks like when I log into Gmail on my iPhone, right? But Google probably wants its customers to be able to log in the way they want it to be. So that's a big driving force behind the Pixel phone.
One of the things that really amazed me, actually, was the turnaround on this phone. I think in the story which you wrote, where you spoke to Rick Osterloh and a bunch of other executives, and this only started going with any sort of gusto about a year ago.
That's right.
And given that we are here already talking about the next generation of iPhone, the 2017 version, and that's a year away from coming to market, and this was barely even a thought at Google. Now clearly that's also a function of the fact that Apple, as we said, has to churn out tens of millions of iPhones for launch date, so they have to have a hell of a long lead time.
But it's also a function of the software. So Google was probably working on this Android software. They had it locked and loaded for a bit, and Google executives, when we talked to them a few weeks ago, were calling this a journey. So this is their first hardware product. So a lot of the components, just like with the original iPhone, completely off the shelf. Year after year, they're going to do more internal testing. Like right now, they outsource a lot of the wireless testing. For next year's model, they're going to do it internally. So every year, you're going to see more extensive work done with the phone, because they're already working on next generation of the Pixel phone. One of the executives was telling me how he's already taking pictures with it in the middle of the night to see the low light abilities. So
we've got one more question, and I think we're going to wrap up, but somebody asking to what extent Google's copying Apple. I think I found quite entertaining, frankly, at the presentation. I watched it remotely, was the fact that there were a few jibes at Apple, about the headphone socket. There is one, a 3.5mm headphone jack in the Pixel. There was at one stage, one of the executives said, "It just works," which is a kind of classic Apple buzz phrase for their presentations. But they seem quite defensive as well about the extent to which the hardware copies Apple.
Yeah, the hardware is quite good. When I picked it up for the first time a few weeks ago, I basically said to myself, this doesn't feel like it's from the same company that makes the Chromecast and made the Google Glass flimsy plastic goggles for $1,500. It felt like a product that came from Apple, and that's no accident. Google bought Nest for $3 billion almost 3 years ago now today, and a lot of the people who worked at Nest worked on the original iPhone, the original iPad, the original iPod, early versions of the Mac. So it's no accident that it's close to something you would expect from a group of Apple employees.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for following along, if you were able to do so. Please do follow us, Bloomberg Technologies team. We're just @technology on Twitter. Hope to see you more regularly when we're making this a regular show. And yeah, thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you.
You all clear? Yeah. Cool. Was it all right? Cool. Thank you. Thanks very much.
I don't know that it was being recorded. We were live streaming.
Yeah, but it's automatically recorded.